Hey, everybody, welcome to episode 388 of the Running Rogue podcast. This is your host, Chris McClung, here with co host James Dodds with an S. Excited to be back with you in another podcast episode. Today, we're going to actually start to get into some of the practical application of our training philosophy. We've spent a lot of episodes now kind of building the philosophical framework for what we do. And now we're going to start getting into tactics. Today is going to be an episode about quality or speed, as some like to call it. So we call our speed workouts quality workouts. And we're going to talk about what that means. What is quality? How do we define that? What are the categories of quality workouts? And then how are each of those applied? What do they look like? Where do they fit in the training? And then, of course, some examples of each. So we'll get into that today. Exciting stuff as we start to get to more of the application side of the equation here as we step through chapter 5 in the book for those that are following along that way. But first, how are we doing, James?
I'm doing well. It's a bluebird day. I learned that from my time in Idaho. I guess it's common among ski culture or like mountain towns and stuff. But yeah, it's a bluebird day. Crisp, cold, bright sunshine. Got to run in. Life's good.
Very good. Love that. So today we're going to be talking about quality speed workouts. But before we get there, I wanted to, again, kind of lay the foundation for getting to this point. Last week we talked about peaking, and mainly that was a conversation about how do you peak within a training cycle. But really, this kind of topic fits into the macro context of peaking, in that you can't do speed or quality, as we've talked about in prior episodes, until you're ready. So we talked about the frequency, volume, quality, or intensity framework, FVI. And so this is getting to the intensity bucket, which means we can't get to the intensity bucket, the quality or speed bucket, until we're actually ready, until we've established frequency. We've got our volume where it needs to be to justify and give our body the resilience to withstand the quality work. And now we can actually step into that. So I first want to just lay the foundation before we jump into what is quality. I want to lay the foundation for how do we earn quality, essentially, and just remind people of that so that they're not listening to this episode and skipping straight to it. So what would you say? How do you know when you're ready for quality?
It's funny because I was just thinking, as you were talking, I was like, the ideal, I didn't know you had asked me this question, but I was like, the ideal would be when you reached a volume target and you were doing it consistently enough that you were like, man, I like my routine. I like my life. But I just feel like I jog 50-mile weeks or 40-mile weeks. And we should probably drill into some numbers because they're probably going to want more practical, but I'm going to stay here for a second. And it's just, I'd really like it if people just got to a spot where they felt like they were rhythmically running and they were almost about to get bored. And then they decided. But that's in the idealistic sense. You know, I know people live in very structured, planned, like I want to peak twice this year. In fact, I wanted to do 3 peaks, but they said last week only do 2 and yada, yada. So in that world, I would say that when it's the volume target that you know for that season. So some might be building up to, let's say, 20 to 25. Others may be building higher. So it's not about a exact specific number. But when you know you have your schedule, your routine, and you can rhythmically do it, and you don't have niggles and naggles, I'd say boom. And we're like, let's say 16 to 20 weeks out from race day. That's when we start layering in qualities.
Yeah, I'm going to paraphrase an X post from Alan Cousins, the coach I've referenced before on here this week. He said, you don't do quality or speed workouts because you're bored. You do them because you're aerobically ready.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're talking about. You need to be aerobically ready, meaning your base and your foundation are established. You've built the routine, i.e. you have the frequency. You've built up volume on top of that routine. And then your body's aerobically ready to take that next step. Or on Rogue, we like to say you're fit enough to really train, which I think offends some people because they're looking at various steps along that path and thinking, oh, I'm fit now, aren't I? Well, maybe, but you aren't quite fit enough to add qualities perhaps. And so that's where you are. You want to be aerobically strong. You want to have that foundation established. Doesn't mean you're at max volume necessarily. Doesn't mean you're not still going to build a little bit from that perspective, but it just means you have enough of a foundation that your body is ready to withstand the intensity of the speed. So one of the rules of thumb that I have used in recent episodes on this is that I like people to get to a 10-mile long run before they add quality. Now, again, there's going to be elements of this that you add before that. Strides, for example, can come early in the process. But workouts beyond that, I like to say as a general rule of thumb, you want to have a 10-mile long run, and you want to have all of your other days established as well. Again, not necessarily that you're peaked in any of those places, but that gives you enough of a foundation that you can be comfortable adding this next step. So if we answer that first question, how do I know if I'm ready for quality? Then the next question is, well, what actually is quality? So how would you answer that question?
Quality is the term we use for workout days or speed days, or anytime you're getting out of that easy pace, seeking some type of intention from the workout. And so it's usually the stuff that we are speaking against when we're making our arguments for slowing down the majority of the miles that you run, because we're in a world where we get the clickbait of like, ooh, this new VO2 max workout or this threshold workout or this, and everybody wants to incorporate it and only do that and not focus on mileage. So we take all those style of workouts and we put them in a bucket called quality. That's the day that when we're locally training, that's the day you're supervised by a coach. And even in our virtual formats, that's the day of the week where we're assigning some kind of workout where we're targeting some kind of specific outcome based on periodization that we talked about last week. So again, that's inclusive of hill work, that's strides, that's fartleks, that's tempo type runs, that's ATLT style workouts. So anything that's quote the track work or the faster road work or the fartleks that we build into programming, the stuff that people mostly focus on. Like you said, it's nice. We get to talk about it now. This is part of our programming. We just had to address all the fundamental components. So equality, long and short of it, is the day when you're not running easy.
I like that kind of process of elimination way of getting to it, because it also, to me, the corollary question to this for some people might be, well, why don't you just call it speed workouts? Why do we say quality and not speed workouts?
I mean, because speed is a very relative term. Like if you were to compare, if I assign 5 by a mile at marathon pace as opposed to 200s on the track, starting at 5K, working down to like mile pace, one would conclude that track workout he just gave is a speed day. And that long, slow mile repeats at my marathon pace, that's my slower day. Or, I don't know what people would say about that. So speed is so relative.
Right.
And it's because I think we're targeting, we need a catch-all term that describes the day where we're targeting some kind of physiological development. So quality is more encompassing, whereas speed is, who knows how people define that.
Yeah, I think speed's definitely a narrower term, so that's part of it. I think the other part of it is that I think speed for a lot of people also implies going to the edge or going to the limit. Mm-hmm. When, as we've talked about in recent episodes, most of the time you're going to be at some level of control. So we want it to actually be a quality experience that is focused on the physiological development zone that you're trying to achieve for that day to get the right benefit so that you can then build the next logical block in the pyramid to your peak. And if we just call it speed, then I think it kind of pigeonholes us into a single box and also implies that it's about that kind of finding the edge all the time, when we want it to be higher quality than that, because it has more dimension to it. So that would be another reason I would say. Third reason also, it's just our way of using.
I was going to say, I don't know a system without that term.
It's just our term. So you could define these things in a lot of different ways, but those are a couple of reasons how we got there. And then the next logical question is, okay, well, what are the categories of quality workouts. And we're going to go through 4 of them today. And as I said, we'll kind of give you the why behind each. We'll give you where it fits. And then we'll also talk about some example workouts so that you can get a framework for what we actually mean when we're talking about each category. And then, of course, in the book, we actually talk about each of these categories in a little more depth and with more examples. But we'll touch on those things today. So there's 4 categories. There's, again, just to be clear, other people may define and categorize these things differently. This isn't, we're not sort of claiming we have a monopoly on how you define quality workouts. These are just the buckets that make sense to us, and other people may quantify them or categorize them in a different way. And so it's less about, the exact buckets and more about what are we trying to accomplish with each one. And from our perspective, these 4 categories are relatively comprehensive for a distance runner. So 4 categories: running economy workouts, 1, 2 VO2 max workouts, 3 threshold workouts, 4 race specific workouts. And again, other people may have other categorizations. You may even come up with additional categories if you want to split things up a little bit differently. But those are the 4 that we cover in the book and what we'll talk about today for the framework for this conversation. So we start with running economy workouts. Another term for this that I like to use is speed development workouts. So think of these workouts where you're primarily trying to trigger neuromuscular development versus some sort of specific aerobic output. Now, there might be some aerobic gains that come with it, but those are secondary to the form efficiency and the neuromuscular communication that you're really trying to facilitate with these running economy workouts. So let's just start there. We've talked about these a little bit already. We talked about strides, I think, a few weeks ago. So what are the first thoughts that come to your mind when you think running economy workouts?
Honestly, strides, strides, maybe straights and curves. Those are the main 2. Hill strides. But these are those early on where you're, they're not just in the priming phase. We keep strides all throughout the season. But it's a gear that you touch that's just absolutely faster than all of your other workouts that you're doing on quality days. But like you said, it's keeping everything turned on. It's reaching down and saying, hey, I need those fast twitch fibers. I need you to not only stay awake, that whole use it or lose it principle. So we activate them, we reach for them, we build up to that high speed, hold, come out of it. And I know we explained that last week, but that is, quote, literally what comes to mind is stride work.
Yeah, so it's controlled speed in a sense, or controlled sprints in various capacities, so that we cultivate a couple different things. One, neuromuscular communication. So we're sort of facilitating the nervous system's ability to activate the muscles that we need and activate them in the way that we need them to go faster. So we're cultivating that. We're also cultivating form and efficiency, which is a related point, but it's also, there's other elements to that of making sure the muscles can move freely through space at the top end speeds. And through that neuromuscular communication, you're activating them in the right sequence. One thing that tends to happen with running economy work is you become more efficient at moving through your form in the way your body works, so that, yes, you can be faster, but also so that you burn less energy while doing it, which is really important as we build to those longer distances in the half and the full distance. So those are the primary things that we're accomplishing with strides and with short hill reps and straights and curves, as you mentioned. But it's about that priming the system so that it has access to the speed you need when you need it. As I said a couple episodes ago, I think of strides or running economy work sort of like allergy shots for speed. You do them once or twice. It doesn't really make a difference. You do them repeatedly, week in and week out, throughout a training cycle. And then over a period of years, it gradually makes changes to your form, to your efficiency, to your ability to access speed that you can then recruit and call upon when we get to the other 3 categories. And then certainly when you get to race day.
Yeah, it's funny you went that direction again, because I was in my head thinking it's low dose. I used to describe them to athletes and especially newer athletes, I'll just call them like salt and pepper. So it's not the whole meal. There's big qualities that actually come down the road, but this is turning all the light bulbs on.
Turning the light bulbs on. So that's the sort of why, the neuromuscular recruitment, the forming efficiency, the where you've already alluded to, meaning everywhere in a sense. This is the salt and pepper. So it has application basically week in and week out, whether you're in a specific training cycle or not. We encourage people to do at least one stride workout a week. And then here in a second, we can talk about that in more depth and other examples, but it kind of stays with you always. And it's something you should always be touching on at least a little bit, regardless of where you are in your training journey, so that you always have access to that speed when it's time. But the doses are low enough, just enough salt, just enough pepper, that it doesn't ruin the meal.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about some examples. Before I guess we get into the breadth of examples, I do want to drill in on strides and just cover this again in depth, because strides should be done in a way that is additive, that is just a small dose, as we've already alluded to. So it needs to be executed effectively and executed in a way that doesn't make it a full-on workout in a sense. So what are strides? What does that look like? Strides are an 80 to 100 meter short controlled sprint. I think that's the best summary that I usually give. So about the straightaway on a track, flat, so that you don't have any hill stimulus. And what you're going to do is build your speed for a third of that distance, hold your speed for a third of that distance, let off the gas and cruise the final third, so that you're not getting faster at the end, but you're just kind of cruising and gradually coming to a halt. And then you walk back for full recovery to the start of your stride, and you repeat that. 4 to 6 is the dose that we recommend, so not a lot of them. And in that middle section, you might get to 85 to maybe even up to 95% of peak speed, but you're only holding it for about 30 meters. So it's a very controlled dose. This is not like wind sprints you did in school sports, right? Where you're gassers, as some people call them, or it's a shuttle run where you finish and you're almost throwing up over your shoes. It's not that at all. It's actually, as we've alluded to before, it's alactic, meaning we don't want to actually build an aerobic stimulus. We want the stimulus to be all neuromuscular. So you get that 80 to 100 meter build. It has this ebb and flow. Walk back for full recovery, so the heart rate is, in control the entire time, and then you go again. But a small dose, and something that I think takes a little bit of practice to learn to execute well. But as we've talked about, when you do it well, it's fun because it's not very taxing on the system and you get to run fast.
Mm-hmm.
So we love our strides around here. Where do strides fit? Strides fit typically at the end of a run. We like to do them at the end of our medium long runs. But if you're building, it might sit on your speed day before you've added other quality workouts at the end of the run. So you've got plenty of warm up, and then you execute the strides, and then you call it a day. And it can fit after a medium long run, could also fit after a shorter easy day. We don't typically want you to do them after long runs or after quality where you're doing other speed work as well. So that's strides. Did I miss anything?
No. No. I'm almost feeling self-conscious because I can't quite remember what all I said last week about strides. So I'm like,
I think it was 2 weeks ago, but yes, we've talked about strides before. They're important. And if you haven't incorporated them into your routine, you should, because this is an easy effort way to get faster without it being annoying or being too hard. In fact, it should be easy. It should feel comfortable. The only other thing I'll mention here is that strides to me also flex depending on the day, depending on how you feel. As you go through them, they should flex a little bit, meaning sometimes you'll get to the end of a run and the legs will be a little bit tired for whatever reason, your stride should reflect that. Start a little more gradually that day. Build into them. You want to kind of progress into them as your body warms into the stride. So it should flex. Some days you're going to get to the strides and you're going to say, all right, I got 4 to 6 on my agenda, but I only feel like doing 4. Or maybe you get through 4 and you're like, I feel great. I'll do 2 more. So they should be flexible based on how the legs are feeling, meaning you're only pushing them as much as they're giving you. And then you're flexing the reps based on how you feel as well. And people I know struggle with that. They're like, well, how many should I do? And I say, well, you do as many as your body wants you to do, which takes a little bit of practice trusting your gut on that. But to me, it's really important because I'll have days where I feel great, 6, no problem. All other days where it feels like a chore, I'm like, okay, we're stopping at 4 today. And there's not necessarily a rhyme or reason to that, but it's just you take what your body has for you that day and you don't take more.
There's also how you do them. Like if you overshoot the mark early on, you might be done at 4 because then you're just kind of holding on. But if you approach that first one at like 60 or 70% of effort, then your second one you bump to like 70 to 80 and you find that feel control rhythm in the third where you're going a little faster and you've maintained that control that you've gotten from those first 2, well, then that opens up a little more space there. For a very mature veteran athlete, I think they have much greater awareness. So they can start that very first rep on point, so to speak. But it's never going to hurt to kind of sandbag that first one just slightly so you get that feel of where you are that day.
Absolutely. And then build into it. We always talk about progression. Progress into it. And again, with that full walk back recovery, you should feel good after each one. So strides are kind of the poster child of running economy workouts. Has a place week in and week out. There are other examples. You referenced already straights and curves, which is kind of like a stride workout, but on steroids. And so a straights and curves workout is a workout that you would do on the track. Typically, we structure these as 12 to 14 times around the track where you're going stride on the straight, super easy on the curves, and you're alternating that rhythm throughout each of those laps. Often taking a little longer recovery after 4 or 6 laps as you go through it. But it's a workout that is stride based, but when you've developed a little bit more aptitude for applying that inside a cycle, then you can do a straights and curves workout, which builds you up to perhaps as many as 24 strides in one single workout. You wouldn't do that necessarily in a base phase for most people, but that's going to come a little bit later in a program. And it could fit in strength phase or the race specific phase, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, because it's a way to essentially take that speed that we've already recruited and kind of double down on it, so to speak.
And I like layering that one in as a down week workout because it's honestly a way to do strides, but because it's continuous, it keeps people honest. I think, and I'm glad you emphasized earlier that you want to walk back and then start the next one. I really don't love it when athletes will basically stride in one direction, wait 2-3 seconds and then shoot right back. In their mind, I think they're like, well, this will save me time, and it's going to take twice as long to walk all the way back. But you don't let all that acid and lactate kind of clear the body. You do get a little bit of a spike from that. So by like not having a longer recovery, it's no bueno. Second, and that was the original point, but it was when you're doing it continuously, I think there's a little more honesty in there in not overdoing, quote, the stride, because you don't come out of it and walk back. You will shift to an easy jog, an easy recovery, but I think just the way it lays itself out, especially knowing if there's multiple laps, it keeps people just a little bit more honest.
Yes, and I always emphasize if you're doing a straights and curves workout that you make sure you have enough polarization between your straightaways and your curves. Common mistake I see in that type of workout is the curves are too fast. So then it becomes an aerobic workout instead of a economy workout. And so you want to make sure your curves are super, super easy, shuffle jog, as we like to say, or glacially slow, so that you can actually put the emphasis on the stride part or on the straightaways. So that's sort of an example of more of an advanced stride workout. The other running economy workout category that we love, really that dates back to Lydiard, is hill strides or hill. He would have people do hill bounding type workouts as a workout that you would do in the priming or base phase to prepare for the harder work to come. So we like to sprinkle in periodically hill strides as another type of stride workout where you're doing the same concept of a stride, but on a 60 to 80 meter gradual hill, so that you're getting a little bit of that incline stimulus, which forces recruitment of things like the glutes and other muscle groups that you might not necessarily as easily access on the flat ground. And so hill strides are another good formative priming workout, and then it might have their application in other periods as well if you're trying to recruit running economy. So, and I guess we should make sure we delineate a hill running economy workout is different than a hill rep workout. Because this is a workout where you're focused, again, not on the aerobic stimulus, you're focused on the neuromuscular stimulus that the hill actually provides. And so typically with hill stride workouts, again, you're getting that full walk back recovery. If you get to the bottom and you still need more recovery, you're getting more recovery. So you're doing plenty of recovering with the hill and not just going hard up and down.
Mm-hmm. I think of it as isolating power there. And as long as someone's not dealing with any kind of like posterior chain issues, like Achilles issues or calf issues, etc., then, these shorter hill strides are actually like, not only is it lower impact because the stride shortens, because if you pictured like a step, you're not going through the full cycle. So the short straightens, and so it's lower impact, but you're also generating so much force just to propel yourself up the hill. So if they were looking at their watch, their flat stride, obviously, I know this is obvious, their flat stride might be faster when they look at the pace they were running, but you're generating so much force to propel yourself uphill that these become beneficial. They're short.
Short, and as the great Frank Shorter says, hills are speed work in disguise. So it's also typically a way to get a neuromuscular stimulus without the same impact that you might have on flat ground. And so we like these hill strides kind of early in a training cycle, do them in the priming phase so that all of the muscles are recruited and ready to go. The other thing you can work on with hill strides is really solid hill form. And we like to talk about keeping the body and the eyes upright. Eyes up is one, or eyes to the top of the hill is one cue that I like to use. Sternum up, turnover increased a little bit. So you're taking short, quick steps and driving those knees and arms on a hill incline that is gradual enough. And we usually say 4 to 6% grade. So that's recognizable as a hill, but not so steep that you're having to change your form to get to the top. So those are some other cues to use when working in hill strides or mini hill reps. But again, these are different. These are about neuromuscular recruitment. They're not about aerobic work, because you can also get some hill workouts that are VO2 max or some of the other categories specifically as well. So there you go. Running economy, kind of the foundation of quality workouts, and they have their place kind of throughout a training cycle. And you want to be sprinkling in small doses here and there, that salt and pepper, to make sure that the neuromuscular system is ready to roll. Shall we go to 2? Second category here is VO2 max workouts. VO2 max workouts. I would love to just start with the definition. VO2 max is a term we hear a lot these days because of all the longevity experts are talking about how VO2 max means you can live longer if you have a high VO2 max. What do we actually mean when we're talking about VO2 max?
It's, I think of two things. It's oxygen carrying capacity, and I think of 5K because it's closely associated with 5K pace style workouts. But yeah, it's increasing your ability to like carry. So we talked about aerobic development, like building out mitochondria and everything, but VO2 max workouts increase that carrying capacity.
It's about capacity. It's about essentially the maximum oxygen you can take into the system. So O2 max, kind of referencing that shorthand, the maximum oxygen you can take into the system to then utilize when you're going fast, effectively. And it's a number, and you'll hear people say, typically somewhere between 35 and 75 VO2 max numbers out there, with 75 obviously being really high and typically more closely associated with elite athletes. And then as you go down the list, you have less genetic potential perhaps, as well as less developed fitness if you go down the scale. But it's all also done on per kilogram body weight. So there's a weight, basically the amount of oxygen, the maximum oxygen you can take in per kilogram of body weight to make the system go. And that's where we're working on with VO2 max. You typically, and there's different ways to measure this. Typically, when you're measuring VO2 max, you have to go into a lab to do it. They put you on a treadmill with an oxygen mask, and they have you run really hard to the point where you're going basically all out. And they're measuring how much CO2 is coming out, which helps them through the formulas figure out how much O2 is going in, so that you can actually measure your oxygen uptake that way. And, the other way to kind of measure VO2 max, which our friend Jack Daniels, really kind of mastered the art of helping people figure this out, is just by running really fast over a 2-mile interval or a 3,000 meter interval, because that's about the point, if you're going all out over 2 miles, that you hit VO2 max. And so when we talk about the 2-mile time trial, or when you hear people talk about a 2-mile time trial, then that's typically why they're doing a 2-mile time trial, is essentially a proxy way of figuring out your VO2 max, which can then help you extrapolate your potential at other distances. So what do we do to work a VO2 max? Typically VO2 max, as you said, is also associated with 5K racing, or it starts to hit the border with 10K racing or 8K racing as well. So that's kind of the category. When I think VO2 max, I think, all right, we're working on kind of 3K to 10K outputs and trying to improve over those distances. Now, VO2 max has a place in all training, regardless of whether you're training for a 3K or up to a marathon. But obviously, typically, the shorter the race, the more you're going to emphasize these types of workouts. And usually when we do them, we're working at a just sub VO2 max level. So VO2 max, because it is max oxygen uptake, it's hard on the body, it's hard on the system. So when we're doing VO2 max, we're typically not going all the way to VO2 max, but we're working just below that. And so often when you hear workouts that are kind of between 5K and 10K pace ranges, typically, not always, typically, those workouts are designed to work on VO2 max. So now I feel like we're beating a dead horse, but what are we missing on VO2 max? Anything on the background and the why and what it means?
No, except for I like that you emphasize sub-maximal, and that's often why we'll include 10K pace in there, because there's the pace recommendation, which is easing you down towards potentially faster. But then also sometimes we come right at it with 5K pace or 3K pace, but we extend recovery. So there's different ways you can always play with the recovery variable or the pace itself as you're easing people in towards these. Because we might have a focus and we might be trying to do a VO2 max workout, but there's also a progression that the athlete's following as well. And so if we have to ease them in with 10K pace and work them down over time, then so be it.
And it's kind of interesting. It dovetails with our conversation from last week, but when we're trying to develop something in our running training, usually if we're trying to develop that specific thing, usually we're working just shy of it. And we're trying to push it further out. So in order to push VO2 max up or out from a pace perspective, we got to work just short of it to kind of push it out. And we'll talk about something similar. If you're trying to improve lactate threshold, usually you're working just short of it Because if you go over the edge on these things, then it's becomes unproductive. But if you're working just shy of it, then it actually helps you push that boundary further out, expanding the comfort zone, as we like to talk about, or as we're now liking to talk about. So that's kind of the why. It's typically, and I guess, the other way to say this is if you're thinking about VO2 max workouts, you're working kind of, as far as distance runners are concerned on speed, kind of pure distance runner speed is sort of the best way to put it. So where do VO2 max workouts fit?
Well, I think you said it earlier, but like they'll be put in every phase. They'll be, long, like way behind it. We'll incorporate them in the priming phase. If in the aerobic strength phase, we're rotating between, longer duration workouts to build aerobic strength, we also might come and touch it on down weeks or even in a second up week. Perhaps you can use it in the first up week. So it's the way you use it in each phase that matters. And then of course in the race specific, it's very obvious in the speed track, but even in a marathon track, we might have someone working closer to their race pace so they're getting dialed in, and then marry that with a VO2 max workout on the other side to make sure that system is staying intact.
And to make race pace feel easier.
And make it feel easier.
By touching on speed. So it's kind of a good reminder here that really all of these categories can be sprinkled, in different spots depending on how they're constructed. And that would mean what the exact paces are, what the exact intervals are, what the recovery intervals are, how the recovery is structured. And so you can essentially apply all of these workouts at any point. Mm-hmm. It just depends on how it's actually structured. But there's going to be, perhaps areas where you see these show up a little bit more or in a more robust fashion. And I think typically VO2 max workouts are going to fall most often and kind of in their most robust form in that race specific phase, because you're working on high end speed and you're wanting to make race pace feel as easy as possible. And if you're in 5K and 10K training, then those are race specific paces. So you're going to be hitting those with a lot of frequency in that final phase. So I don't want to say it's exclusively there because we just said it isn't and it can fit anywhere, but I tend to put the most robust forms of VO2 max workouts towards the end of the cycle because the system is fully ready to absorb that work. So what are some examples of VO2 max workouts?
I like 200s and 400s. Starting with in and out, you can stretch those from 200s to 300s to 400s. You can start with longer recovery variables and whittle those down as the season goes on. And so there's a couple of different ways to come at it. But for the most part, I rely heavily upon 200s and 400s. But we can also flip those into fartlek style workouts, which is simply speed play. So it's a time-based variation of that. So all three of those would fit, which gives a coach a lot of creativity and gives the athlete variety.
Yeah, and I think even as long as 800-meter workouts, can fit into this category. Typically, if I'm going to do a VO2 max workout in 800 format, then it's going to be one where you progress into those paces. So one of my favorites is 8 times 800, and I usually like to introduce this maybe during the strength phase, and you do a version of it also in the race specific phase that's more robust or aggressive, but you might do 2 reps at half marathon pace to start, 2 reps at 10K pace, and then the last 4 or sometimes 2 to 4 at 5K pace. So you're kind of building into it, 2 minutes rest between each. It's a classic VO2 max workout essentially, but it allows the body to kind of warm into it. So you're not just getting thrown to the wolves from rep 1. Mm-hmm. And then maybe later you bring back that same 800-meter workout and you go straight into 10K pace instead of half marathon pace, or even sometimes straight into 5K if you're doing a 5K block with sometimes even up to shorter rest, like 90 seconds rest, but it's another way to hit that stimulus over a little bit longer rep format. We also might do speed ladders where you touch on, certain paces and kind of go up and down the ladder. One of our favorite VO2 max workouts of sorts is the Texas 10K.
Mhm.
And that's where you do a 10K paced ladder where you do typically 4 times 400, 2 times 800, 1 times mile, 2 times 8, 4 times 4, all at 10K pace, kind of up and down the ladder, touching on that kind of just sub VO2 max level, but doing in a way in the training cycle, typically late in the training cycle, where it feels very, very comfortable and in control so that you can learn to make that rhythm feel even easier, which pushes out that VO2 max.
Mm-hmm. I like 2-4-6 ladders, 4-6-8 ladders as well. You have to do multiple sets to kind of find the right volume for those, but you can do 200s, 400s, 600s, 400, 200s, or 400, 600, 800. So I actually like playing around with those variables based on who the athlete is and where we're at. But that Texas 10K I love as like a late stage for half or full, and then also a race specific for speed track.
We can also turn them into fartleks, you know, 3, 2, 1 fartlek workout, can hit all these paces as well. So there's a lot of different ways. And I think, you know, this category is probably the easiest in terms of people thinking, oh, okay, that's familiar, you know, because it's a lot of sort of traditional quote unquote speed workouts fall into this VO2 max category. So typically when you're hearing some of these examples, you're like, oh, okay, I know that one, right? Because it's what you most often hear about, the sort of sexiest workouts, so to speak, but all pretty straightforward. I think not the most important, but one of the main things to remember with VO2 max workouts is that you can't overdo them. You have to be very cautious about how you spend time in this space, in this zone, and when and where you do it, because it's easy to overdo it, to go overboard, because you are working on the fast end of the range. It's taxing on the system more, perhaps requires a little bit more recovery on the other side. So you have to do it in a way that's intentional, that's measured, and that is very cautious about not going overboard.
Yep. I hope people just keep that in mind with inequalities in general. I know it's like it needs more emphasis here because things are burning hot, and so they can accidentally overdo it. So it deserves special emphasis. But I want that mindset for quality in general.
Yeah, I agree. When in doubt, choose easier. When in doubt, choose easier. I mean, we've said that over and over, and hopefully it'll finally register, but it's just true.
Yeah.
You know, I'd rather you be healthy and slightly undercooked on the starting line than injured or overcooked, because healthy and slightly undercooked is going to beat injured or overcooked pretty much every single day of the week. And for most of us, especially those that are kind of new in our journey, that's the way to get there anyway, is to always be slightly undercooked. So be cautious of how you apply these VO2 max workouts, even though they're the ones that you like to brag about on Strava. They look good. They look good on the social media shares and all that stuff. They're, again, as I said, kind of the sexy ones, but we have to apply them carefully. Okay, so that's VO2 max. Then we're going to get to threshold workouts. For anybody who was on our Q&A last Friday, and again, we do a weekly Instagram Q&A at 2 p.m. Central if you want to jump on and ask questions. But we had a good question from David, who's one of our athletes, he was asking about threshold one, LT1, LT2, or T1 and T2, threshold 1, threshold 2. And so this kind of hits that bucket of things that we're going to talk about now. Threshold workouts. Also, another word we use for threshold workouts are aerobic strength workouts. These are workouts that build our endurance, our staying power. So if VO2 max kind of works on speed from a distance runner's vantage point, then threshold works on staying power, the ability to hold those speeds for longer and longer periods of time. And this is where physiology becomes really important. And I like people to, if they can, follow me on this in the audio, visualize this curve. You know, when you're running easy, everything's cool. Nothing's really happening. You're just chilling. Heart rate's low. Body's like thinking, I can do this for a long time. This is awesome. And then at some point, when you start to get a little bit more effort, the body starts to produce something called lactate, which is essentially a buffering mechanism, but also can become a fuel and something you can reuse as fuel in the processes of energy creation in the body. And so lactate starts to get produced at elevated levels. That means, hey, we're working a little bit. And that first point at which you get to elevated lactate levels in the bloodstream is called aerobic threshold. So it's the threshold at which lactate's up, but it's still very aerobic. We're in a good place. We're starting to produce this buffering agent, but it's all good. But then you're on this curve, as I mentioned, so it starts to increase as effort increases from there. At some point, it reaches kind of this plateau where lactate is elevated, but it's at a kind of this plateau where it's sustainable and you're producing it, or you're reusing it or discarding it as waste in a way that's at equilibrium effectively. That's an effort level that we like to call tempo. Some people use that word differently, but that we like to call it tempo, kind of the middle of the two lactate or the two thresholds associated with lactate. So we start with aerobic threshold at the first increase in lactate. Then we get to tempo where it kind of plateaus. And then at some point we hit lactate threshold, also called anaerobic threshold, where lactate starts to overwhelm the system. And you're on a short path at that point to having to slow down once you're going anaerobic. And so when we're working on threshold workouts, we're working on the various ends of that range, from improving our aerobic threshold to push out that point at which lactate starts to get produced, to improving our tempo effort, where our body's becoming more efficient at staying in that equilibrium when lactate's being produced, to pushing out lactate thresholds so that we go anaerobic later or at faster speeds. So threshold workouts encompass that entire range. And what's the why behind them? We spend time in the threshold kind of range or zones so that we can become better at processing and using lactate. Therefore, we have staying power. We can hold those slightly uncomfortable paces for longer and longer periods of time. And this is where there's more magic in staying in control and making each effort feel as relaxed as possible versus continuing to step towards that edge. I'll pause there. Have I missed anything?
No, I'll add a visual, and I would love to give credit for whoever came up with this, but someone gave me this visual like 10, 12 years ago, but they described that like in that window between AT and LT, or LT1 and LT2, is like a revolving door that you see like at banks in New York where people are coming in, coming out. It's like, it's that recycle phase. It's just like, I'm glad you emphasized that lactate is a buffer and it can be used as a fuel source as long as you don't tip over that LT2 or lactate threshold or anaerobic threshold. So it's wild how many terms come with each of these. But that visual stuck with me, and it helped me both with coaching and when executing a workout, because I knew if I was only charged with my brain and I was just like push, and then all of a sudden I could feel my body shutting down. I was like, man, well, I've kind of killed the workout and ruined it. Fine, live to see another day as long as I don't force after that. But I think thinking of that in and out window was helpful.
I like that. You don't want, you need that equilibrium too, right? Too many people coming in and it jams the door. Mm-hmm. If you start to go too hard, lactate production increases, it jams the door, and then suddenly you're on a short list. Mm-hmm. You're on a short cycle to having to finish. So that's sort of the scientific part of this. You're trying to build staying power with these workouts, which is really about managing control and being relaxed and smooth at these slightly slower, but still working kind of effort levels. And just to give you a sense for what effort levels we're talking about, aerobic threshold, that first threshold you hit, is typically about the effort you could sustain for 2 hours of all-out effort. So it should be a pace that you get into where you think, man, I can hold this for 2 hours. Otherwise, you're going too fast. Typically, for most people, that falls between. I was just thinking about this in Kipchoge context, but typically for most people, it falls between marathon and half marathon pace. For Kipchoge, it actually is marathon pace.
Yeah, it's race pace.
But which, kind of tells you something about how he can sustain that. It's actually his aerobic threshold. And then there's lactate threshold. Some people call this tempo. We don't use that vernacular, but lactate threshold is typically about the pace you can hold for 1 hour all out, which for most of us falls between half marathon and 10K pace. For Kipchoge, it falls about half marathon pace. And so that kind of gives you a sense. So we're not going faster than 10K pace. So it's kind of between 10K and marathon is where this falls, not perfectly, but that kind of gives you a sense for it. These are longer, more controlled efforts. And the more you can improve your threshold levels, the more you have that staying power, particularly in the half and the full. So hopefully that covers the why. What's the where? And we actually answered this in detail. I did on the call or on the Instagram live last Friday. I'll give you the chance to quickly run through it.
Aerobic strength, which is your definition of aerobic strength. I know there's the strength component too. So we might do stuff up and over hills to like develop muscular strength. But it's because, like you said in the opening definition, even in this particular part of the conversation, this is where you get that staying power, i.e. your endurance, your ability to process lactate. So that's going to come in the aerobic strength.
Yes, most often, but it might have, again, application everywhere depending on what you're trying to do. As I was referencing with David, you might do like a broken tempo workout in the priming phase to kind of help prepare the body for future threshold work, where you're doing short intervals of tempo effort or lactate threshold effort. And then once you get into that aerobic strength phase, that's where the meat of this work happens, where we're really emphasizing these different effort levels and doing things, like aerobic threshold work, or what we like to call steady work, tempo runs, maybe even some progressions where you're working through the range in that aerobic strength phase. Then there might be even manifestation of it in the race specific phase, particularly if you're doing a half marathon, because you're working on, if you're at half marathon pace, for most people, that's typically around the middle of the thresholds. And so that's that opportunity to kind of work on the tempo effort or that staying power where you're reaching that elevated level of lactate, but staying at equilibrium. So that might manifest in the race specific phase so that you can dial into that pace and therefore effort and become more efficient at it. So it can have a place anywhere along the spectrum, but just like, VO2 max typically falls more in that race specific phase, threshold will typically fall more in that aerobic strength phase. And we've already alluded to some examples, but what's your favorite threshold workout example?
I'm glad you said example at the end, because I was like, my favorite. Like I'm like, I don't love this, but I assign it and I explain it to athletes as
this is not your favorite.
Well, I know what a personal favorite workout is, but yeah, this is my least likable or enjoyable, yet I find it to be tremendously important. I'll tack on too, because we were talking about the phases, that these should come in progressions as well. Like the whole season progresses, just like workouts progress. So I've gotten to where I assign AT and LT, and that's largely based on behavior. Because like it's like increasingly athletes want a very specific number, and they want it to be verified in their watch, or maybe even schedule it in their watch. And so I've just gotten to where a really nice way to come at this is to, late priming, early aerobic strength, give 4x8 to 10, start at the AT, work down to the LT. And so there's 4 different like bite-sized chunks where they're practicing just
8 to 10 minutes.
Yes, 8 to 10 minutes. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And then that will advance 3-4 weeks later to something like 2x20 or 2x15 to 20, depending on where the athlete is. But it's just a progression. Like let's say they hit 4x8. So that particular athlete, I would encourage them to go 2x16 in their next. And so then by the time you get to the third, which could almost bleed into that race specific, or really at the end of aerobic strength is that 1 by 35 minutes or 1 by 40 minutes. I've taken some athletes a little bit higher, but like you said, we stay behind it. So if it's the equivalent of a 1 hour race pace, well, if we assigned them a full hour, that would be like having a race, i.e., spending all their savings. And so once I get up past that 40-minute mark, we're getting it can get a little hairy. And so that's kind of where I cap those. Those are my favorite, largely because they seem the most transferable. There's so many other ways to do it, but the athletes understand that. They're like, okay, I'm starting off in that first 3 minutes of, let's say, that 8 to 10, and I'm starting at my AT, and I'm just working down towards the LT. Early on, I would assign right at LT, and too many people would just overshoot the mark, blow up. I would not only see physical issues, but also like psychological issues. So teaching them just by spelling it out that way, I feel like it's helped them relax back early on and work towards it in that proper manner.
Yeah. Yeah. People overcook. Lactate threshold is a delicate one. You can only stay there for so long, and if you go over the edge, it's dangerous. So I like that progression as well. One of my favorites, if we're just talking favorites, not only to do but also to give, is 4 to 6 miles continuous at aerobic threshold, or we'll call that a steady run, steady state, because it's the very low end of the range. I love this early in a strength cycle because so it's a very low end of the range. You're kind of away from that lactate threshold edge, but it's a long time to have to work and try to keep a consistent rhythm. So it gives the athlete a long time to be in their head, a long time to be thinking, is this right? Is this right? What's the right effort here? And having to play the mental games of staying in that rhythm while also hopefully trying to make that rhythm feel as easy as they can without being tempted to go harder. And so I love that as a perfect aerobic strength workout. And then also it's not so taxing because you're at aerobic threshold that you can't then, keep rolling. So that's one of my favorites, is give me a good 4 to 6 miles at steady state or 4 to 6 miles at aerobic threshold. Just pure, straightforward, continuous work.
And they'll stay a little more honest when they know there's 6 miles. You calculate
exactly.
That
they have to be cautious. The other thing I think we should note about threshold workouts is that it's really, really important that these are effort zones. It's important to know these are effort zones. And obviously, when you're trying to translate it for people and help them understand what it means, you're telling them paces to kind of give them an idea. It's about in this range from a pace perspective, but it's actually not about pace at all. It's about, are you in the right effort zone to achieve the results you're trying to accomplish? And we've talked early on in this series about running by feel and the importance of that. And this is one of those areas, these categories of workouts where running by feel becomes paramount. You have to really be able to dial into the effort and disconnect from your watch and ask yourself, is this the right effort zone to be getting the right result? Which is really hard to learn and teach, and it takes time, but it's really, really important if you can get it right. And it's also important to recognize that what does that mean? That means that depending on the day, depending on how you feel, depending on the weather, paces might actually fluctuate fairly significantly in order to achieve these same efforts. So on a hot day in Texas, in the middle of the summer, if you're doing an aerobic threshold workout, the pace for that's going to look very different than if you're on a cool day like today with the sun shining, the bluebird day. The pace might be 30 to 40 seconds per mile different. But if the effort's the same, you're getting the same result. And it can be really hard for people to wrap their mind around that idea.
Yeah. On a day like today, they'll turn it into a VO2 max workout.
Yeah. So keep that in mind as you do these. They should be very dialed into effort. And I like to describe those efforts, and I think it's worth mentioning here. Aerobic threshold, kind of, again, that first threshold point, comfortably hard. You should be recognizing that you're working, but in such a way that it is comfortable and rhythmic, and that you feel like you can hold for 2 hours. Then you get to tempo and it's like, okay, I'm working for sure, but I have absolute control over that work. So it's not comfortable anymore, but it's still absolutely in control. And then when you get to lactate threshold on the top end of this range, then it's I'm still in control, but I'm on the very edge of it.
And I'd sure like to be done.
And I'd like to be done. And if I go over the edge, if I feel that, I'm going to be present, recognize it, and pull back until I have control again. So those are some word cues to use to kind of find these different zones, aerobic zones. The other thing I'd like to say as we wrap this category is, to me, if I could only give one pure quality workout, it would be threshold workouts.
That's fair.
It's kind of especially, I mean, it'd be different for 800 meter runners, but for marathoners and half marathoners, give me threshold all day long.
Even 10K. Yeah.
Sure.
Because it's that if strides hit that neuromuscular and that top end and you got all your volume, then boom, we're working right in the middle, getting really efficient at that revolving door recycling.
So it's really important. But I guess I should also relatedly point out, some people think you should do these every week in addition to other workouts. And we don't believe that. These have a time and a place. Probably not doing one more than every other week, even in that aerobic strength phase, and too much of it, and you're going to overdo it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Final comment there.
Oh, it just made me think that I was like, and I think I've mentioned this recently, but it's like, we'll still hit that zone. Like that system's still being activated in other workouts. Like, sometimes I might do an ATLT workout in aerobic strength, and then the following do something like 1864, a workout we use here where it's like just a cut down. It's 1,800, 600, 400, starting at half and ending at 5K. So we're stretching past that zone, but we have actual standstill recoveries in that one. So lactate is rising, and we're not getting the endurance component because of the standstill, but lactate's rising and you're learning to process all that. So you're getting that secondary benefit in this more speed development style descending ladder. And then the previous week, it was truly intentional focus on threshold, right? So there's different ways to hit that system. They don't all have. Does that make in different workouts? Like
Yeah. I mean, I think
up.
you're kind of in some ways inventing the fifth category here, which is that there are workouts that combine sometimes two categories.
Yeah.
For reasons that are appropriate, right? Not something you always want to do, but appropriately managed. Sometimes you might hit on a couple of these categories in one single workout for reasons that make sense. So that's number 3, threshold workouts. Number 4, as we wrap the quality discussion, is race-specific workouts. This one should sound pretty straightforward, but it's really all about dialing into race pace, regardless of what your race distance is. The race, as we like to ask the question, what does the race require? Well, the race requires being able to run that pace you want for the distance that you're targeting. And so in that final phase, right before the taper, you got to spend time particularly working on race pace, dialing into it, because there's not only the physiological aerobic aspects, but there's also the neuromuscular aspects of being able to find and dial into that pace rhythmically. There's also the mental aspects of getting there and making it feel comfortable. And so this is where we spend time on that. And it kind of comes in my mind and at the most basic level, 2 forms. There's probably other examples here, but at least the most important forms I think about are, 1, just pure race pace repeats. These are I had my athletes today who are racing in February here in a week and a half, do 2 to 3 times 2 miles at race pace. Just straightforward miles at race pace with recovery in between. But the other form of the race-specific work that I really like is in and out workouts, where you're intentionally kind of going in and out between a pace faster than race pace and race pace, so that you can feel that effect of recovering at race pace, so that you feel good and smooth and race pace feels even easier. So those are kind of the 2 categories of race pace workouts or race-specific workouts. Again, there's probably other examples and other categories or subcategories here, but those are the two that I most commonly think about. What am I missing though on the why here? Anything?
On the why?
Yeah, the why race specific.
No, hopefully it's somewhat intuitive, but it's like if we spent priming preparing you for aerobic strength, and of course we were using running economy workouts all throughout, you develop that aerobic strength. Now you're literally getting into, hey, what are the demands of the event? And so now we can sort of narrow our focus, and we're thinking, I really need, if for a marathon, I need to be really dialed into MGP. If I only have to run 13 miles, then what's my 13-mile pace? How dialed into that can I get? And so whether that's rotating weeks, i.e. you're doing a fast workout and then coming back to race pace, or even in the same workout where you're moving between, it applies into both. You could do mixed interval or spread it across the 2 up weeks.
Yep. I think the other thing to point out here is that there's a reason race specific, when we kind of talk about the where, there's a reason race specific workouts fall in that 2 to 8 weeks out from race day, is because they may or may not have a physiological sweet spot.
Mm-hmm.
For example, marathon pace kind of falls in this physiological no man's land. And so, a lot of times when people see our programming and they're looking at the earlier phases, they're like, where's the marathon pace work? Well, we actually save that for the very end because, yeah, you need to learn to dial into it, but from a physiological development standpoint, it doesn't really do us anything.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't want to spend too much time there because it's kind of a waste physiologically. But we need to spend some time there so that we can actually find that pace and make it feel comfortable and smooth. So there's a reason that typically these kind of race-specific workouts fit in that place. On the other side of it, if you're looking at 5Ks versus marathons, well, marathon pace, or excuse me, 5K pace, as we talked about earlier, you can't do a ton of like really hardcore 5K workouts.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, you'll get really sharp fast, and then you'll end up overdoing it before your actual 5K arrives. So from that end of the range, we don't spend a ton of time doing a lot of 5K specific race-based work with longer intervals, because you're going to overdo it and you're going to end up racing before your real race. In a sense, you're going to race in a workout. So we have to make sure that these are dosed at the right time, meaning close to race day, and then dosed in the right amount, meaning not too much, so that you end up with your race performance happening in training, which is, we've already talked about that in a few different ways. I mean, the other way, going back to the marathon, is a lot of people will say, well, I'm going to do 20 miles at race pace, right? No, we're not doing 20 miles at race pace for a marathon. That is too much marathon pace work. And that means, hey, you basically raced your race. So that's all a long way of saying we got to make sure these are dosed appropriately.
Mm-hmm. And because of that, I've actually gotten to where, like what you mentioned about MGP being no man's land, but I do this in half programs as well. I've gotten to where I like to that's where I like to assign continuous mileage and have athletes run through their race pace. Because there's a value, I think, in making a pace feel sticky. Like that's why we do hit it, because your legs can, like our muscles, there's a synchronicity to muscle contractions. And so there's not only a physiological side, but also just like psychological. There's something about making a pace feel like home. Like, I don't know why, but when I lock into that, I could just go forever. That's what I want marathoners thinking. We just don't camp out on it forever. So I like to mix that up sometimes, where I might do like 2 to 3 times, something very similar to what you described a second ago, 2 to 3 times 2 miles at their marathon pace. And then I'll usually sandwich that into long runs. But even on the quality day, just starting off like MGP plus 20 and through a 5 mile continuous run, going MGP plus 20, 10, right at that race pace, you feel it, and then you see yourself run past it. I also want them thinking about race day in that kind of workout, because that's kind of what we're going to do on race day anyway. We'll start easy and run through that pace.
Right. A simulation of that close, that fast finish,
Mm-hmm.
hopefully off of race pace. So we're already giving examples. Another example that we've alluded to, which is fine. Another example that we alluded to is this is where the race specific workouts, this is where a whole category of workouts, which we'll talk about in kind of our own chapter about long runs, is long runs with pace work in them, where we like to work on race pace in those long runs, typically 2 or 3 of them building up to a big race. And so this is kind of also where that category of long run workouts will fall, is typically those are all built around this idea of hitting race pace inside a long run so that you can practice it on tired legs. So these are all examples, but to kind of go back and drill in on the in and out example, you know, we've talked about kind of the long intervals at race pace. We've talked about long run workouts where you're working that in. The example I alluded to earlier of in and out, you know, one version of that I like is, for example, for a marathoner, is to do 3 to 4 continuous rounds, so all continuous, no rest, of 400 meters at 5K effort, alternating with 1 mile at race pace, in and out. Mm-hmm. And we have a 1.25 mile loop here around Zilker, the Great Lawn, where we can do that. I'll mark the start, and then the 400 mark, start at 5K effort, then you settle into 1 mile at race pace, marathon typically, and then you come back around to the start and you hit that 5K again for only 400 meters, and then you're dialing into marathon pace. So it gives you this opportunity to, one, make marathon pace feel easier, more comfortable because you're contrasting it with the 5K pace, but it also gives you this opportunity to have to find marathon pace 3 or 4 times so that you're learning to dial into it. Mm-hmm. So that's another one that I like.
And mentally, I could see the value of, like, I mean, I'd walk away from that thinking my recovery was my race pace. How good does that feel?
Right. Exactly. And if you do that late in training when you're fit and ready, it's actually, may it sound hard, but it's actually a very manageable workout. Mm-hmm. Because, yeah, you're recovering at marathon pace effectively. And so then you build a lot of confidence off of that. So those are some examples. I think we're already running long today, so let's tie a bow on this one. Again, 4 categories of quality workouts: running economy, working that neuromuscular system; VO2 max, kind of working on the ability to sustain for 2 to 6 miles; threshold workouts, staying power, endurance; and then race-specific workouts, making sure you can dial into your race pace. All of those have a place, and they all fit somewhere in the training program. Our book, we kind of talk about it, more examples of that, and then as we go through it, we'll also talk about more application of those concepts. But this has been a good overview today. Yeah. Any final thoughts?
I do have a final thought because it's been sitting with me most of the conversation, but that the moment earlier when you had said, when in doubt, we want people to lean towards the easy side, I can't help but want to address a potential rebuttal. And it's not, and you've said this before too, it's not in the spirit of trying to teach people to be soft. It's helping people recognize that when you look at things comprehensively. So when we started early on and talked about FVI, it's like we recommended minimum 4 times per week. And then we also talked about how 16 weeks is short. Most of our programs are like 20 to 22 weeks. We're up to 24 weeks. And so knowing that, it's you have to have a little bit of that I'm going to live to see another day attitude, because while yes, the day you're doing a quality, you want to employ that attitude of, am I doing my best? Which isn't the same as saying, am I going my hardest? You're saying, am I doing my best? Or back to that quality definition of, do I have high quality expectations of myself and of this workout? So yes, you can do your best on that day, all the while knowing I need to be able to get in minimum 3 more runs this week. Most of our athletes train 4 to 6 days a week. And so for a lot of them, it might be, I've got 5 other runs to protect this week. And not only do I have 5 other runs to protect this week, I have 20 weeks in progression, i.e. mileage is going up. And even when I reach that peak in mileage, I haven't reached the peak of the training program. So I'm going to hit my peak in mileage, and the rigor of quality workouts nested inside of the overall volume are going to continually get harder. And so again, it's not the spirit of being soft. It's back to your point of teaching people to maximize control and extend what their comfort zone is.
Yeah, because it's not one workout that matters. It's the body of work,
Yes.
it includes not just the workouts. It includes the easy runs, the long runs, all of it. And so it all has to fit together. And if you put too much emphasis on one quality workout and overdo it, then you've shot yourself in the foot for the rest of it. And therefore you might end up injured or not healthy on the start line and not getting what you want. So it's about keeping that big picture. I've done a podcast on seeing the forest for the trees. So making sure you're staying
Good way to say it.
staying in touch with the forest, even though these workouts kind of represent all the individual trees. You know, no one tree is going to build your forest. You've got to have all of it in order to make this work, or all the pieces of the puzzle to get the most out of your training. So I think that's a good way to wrap it. Just that, yes, quality matters, and it's an important part of the equation, especially as we're reaching potential. But we shouldn't be so enamored by it that we put it on this pedestal that's higher than all the other work, including the easy miles in particular. All right. Well, I think that's a good way to end it. Let's wrap it here, folks. Episode 388. As always, you can check us out at roguerunning.com. Follow us on Twitter X, Facebook, or Instagram at Rogue Running, where you can also pick up the book. Until next time, we'll talk to you soon.